Welcome, everyone, to the monthly gathering of the Canadian Ecopsychology Voices Network. Canadian Ecopsychology Network. Hello, my name is Carol Cozio, and I'm the founder of CEN. Right now, we have the distinct pleasure of Andy Fisher speaking about his latest paper, Ecopsychology as Decolonial Praxis. Dr. Andy Fisher is a healer, scholar, educator, mentor, guide, and circle facilitator. Andy is a major figure in ecopsychology. Author of one of the field's primary texts, Radical Ecopsychology, Psychology in the Service of Life, 2nd edition, he keeps up an active schedule of teaching and writing. Andy is also a rites of passage guide and a psychotherapist in private practice. Welcome, Andy. Thank you for sharing your time and wisdom with us today, and the airwaves are yours.
Okay, well, thanks, Carol. And hello, everyone. I'm going to start just by acknowledging that I'm speaking from unceded Algonquin territory, and I'm a settler here of British descent. And I also want to acknowledge my responsibilities to the Algonquin people here, who are struggling for their political and cultural autonomy, really in their own land. So I want to start on that note. I did write a paper today. I was talking to Carol at the start, and I said, normally I write some notes, but often I wander off script, so I actually wrote something today, and I think I'm just going to read it just to keep myself between the lines. So I will don my glasses here, and hopefully this will come out right. Okay, so I decided not to summarize the whole article because it's a bit long and involved. And if you're interested in it, you can track down a copy and have a read for yourself. But I'll certainly mention some of the ideas from the article. But what I'd like to do is provide a bit of the larger context for the paper and make a number of points that speak to how our field is developing at this moment in history, which is really what I think we need to be talking about. So I start the article with the question, what form ecopsychology needs to take at this epochal moment in order to be adequate to our times. Times when so much life is on the line and when our political systems are failing and sliding to the right in these very authoritarian directions, and when so many people are really just traumatized by what we're witnessing every day. What makes sense for ecopsychology at this point? And my own short answer is that the field needs to be a form of psychology, a radical form of psychology that's explicitly anti-capitalist and decolonial, which is the only way it really makes sense for me at this point. So, what helps me say this is that there are trends both within ecopsychology, but also within the larger world that are likewise pulling in this direction. So in ecopsychology, for example, there's the paper by Alicia Jones and David Siegel on unsettling ecopsychology. There's the writings of Peggy Ayers, who's on the call today. And there's a special edition on ecopsychology and decolonization coming out in the upcoming edition of the Ecopsychology Journal this fall, with Indigenous and settler non-Indigenous authors. And there's also a current within the work that reconnects to decolonize the work and to also introduce more anti-oppression practices into it. And then there's this recent development in the nature connection movement to commit itself directly to Indigenous decolonization, because the source of all the disconnection that the nature connection movement is trying to overcome is actually colonialism, and that's just become very clear in that movement. So I see these and other trends as evidence of a strengthening stream within ecopsychology, broadly considered, that's taking the field in a more sort of historically relevant and reflexive and mature direction. So this is a good thing. And these trends, furthermore, clearly reflect a growing visibility in the larger world of Indigenous sovereignty and resurgence struggles, and a growing interest among settlers or non-Indigenous peoples in supporting these struggles. In fact, many now believe that solidarity with Indigenous peoples has become a global ecological imperative. This is true everywhere, but perhaps playing out most obviously in Brazil, where the destruction of the rainforest is accelerating terribly, and where the government plan is to displace and exterminate Indigenous people in the name of extracting resources from their land. And President Bolsonaro, he in 2007 he said, "Where there is native land, there is wealth underneath it." And this is simply a naked expression of the logic of the capitalist colonial system, operating everywhere around the world. So the point I'm trying to make is that as an eco-psychologist, or as eco-psychologists as a group, I think we need to see the central importance of Indigenous struggles in the world at this moment in history, and to see the particular relevance of this topic to our own field, and then work together to build on the kind of recent developments that I've just mentioned. And I've got a long way to go in my own education in this area. It's very humbling subject matter. But I'll talk a bit next about some of my the evolution of my own thinking in this area, how it led to this paper. So my argument as an eco-psychologist has been that as a field, eco-psychology is an inherently radical project and needs to be developed as such if it's going to give itself a true expression. That's what I've been saying for a number of years. And there are a number of dimensions to this argument, but one of them goes like this. So the ecology movement is about transitioning to an ecological society. Our existing society is capitalist, and the best guide to the nature of capitalist society and to the transition to an ecologically productive society is eco-socialism. And so what I've been saying is that we need to integrate eco-socialist thinking into eco-psychology. However, while not exactly silent on the matter of colonialism, the eco-socialist literature has, for me, not been a sufficient guide to how to think this topic into some radical ecological scholarship. So I've had to have my own sort of moments of awakening, and I've had to read Indigenous scholars and activists, and to get to the point where I am now, where I think I'm just sort of barely ready to kind of start talking about decolonization in this way. So one of my moments of awakening came about a decade ago when I was a bit involved in a political action here that I discuss in the article, in which settlers supported a group of Algonquins in blockading a uranium mining development on their land, and it's not far from where I live. So this was the first time I'd heard the word settler, actually, and part of me at the time just was thinking, this action, this kind of looks what I think eco-psychology needs to look like. So that was a real kind of moment for me. But what I had to work out as a thinker was the relationship between capitalism and colonialism. And, these are obviously connected, but how exactly? So just to oversimplify the process that I went through, one way of putting it is that I had to read the political scientist Glenn Coulthart, who's an Indigenous scholar, a Yellowknives Dene, who talks about Marx. And then at the same time, I had to read the environmental historian Jason Moore, who's a Marxist scholar who talks about Indigenous people. So there was a kind of stitching together that was going on for me with, these two thinkers. But, as I say, that's an oversimplification, but it gives you a sense of process. So as Coulthart says, for Indigenous nations to live, capitalism must die. So that's pretty frank assessment of the situation. And as Moore says, capitalism develops as a system only through commodity frontiers, which are essentially zones of colonization, which is to say zones of theft and destruction of lands and people. And according to Moore, we should call our times the capitalocene rather than the Anthropocene, to make it clear what we're really dealing with. You know, if we're concerned about the Anthropocene, well, the Anthropocene is really the capitalocene. But as Donna Haraway and Anna Singh argue, we could also call it the Plantationocene, which is a term that really underscores that the capitalist laws of motion follow a colonial logic, which with maybe sort of palm oil plantations being the current emblem. So although we tend to think of capitalism as an economic system, it's more deeply or foundationally a colonial system that has to steal and destroy in order to produce the inputs that it then delivers to the economic system, more narrowly conceived. And as eco-psychologists, we have to understand the nature of the capitalist colonial system, not just because it's wasting the planet, which it is, but also because it makes the world or the historical space within which we think and we feel and we perceive and we imagine. It makes the space, in other words, for the subject matter of psychology. So capitalism isn't this sideshow. It's right at the heart of thinking about ecology and psychology. And as I say in the article, ecological consciousness can find very little purchase in the capitalist world precisely because this world produces narcissistic and egoic and anti-ecological consciousness by design. That's what it does. That's the kind of consciousness that's congruent with the capitalist system, the colonial system. So I argue in the article that eco-psychology is a project to overcome not just the division between psyche and nature, which is what we normally think about, but also the division between psyche and nature and society. Indeed, I see society as the crossroads where psyche and nature actually meet. And this is a view that avoids the illusion that this human-nature relationship exists in some kind of pure space, removed from questions of power and all the unfinished business of history. So I argue that the fracturing of reality into the separate realms of psyche and nature and society is inherent in modern capitalist civilization. These divisions are necessary for the continuation of this civilization, which survives only through continuous processes of disconnection and colonization. So the conceptual division, to take one example, between society and nature, what this does is it sets up nature as a devalued realm to be exploited, appropriated, and destroyed in the process of accumulating capital. So we say society's here, nature's there, and we can do what we want with it because it's not society where the realm of value lies. And as Jason Moore argues, this devaluing process is then extended to a large group of oppressed human groups who have historically been categorized as nature and then similarly violated. So indigenous peoples and people of color and women and working class people and so on. So this division between society and nature is very much a tool of this kind of colonial enterprise. And this, in short, is why I say that eco-psychology, if it's a project to overcome the modern fracturing of reality, then decolonization is the deepest context for developing our field. And so broadly speaking, what I think this would look like, first of all, is that for any major topic or practice of interest to eco-psychology, we would need to learn what an indigenous rather than a Eurocentric perspective might be on that topic, and then see how this deepens our understanding of the topic and of our sense of responsibility related to it. So for example, I'm currently reading a book by the Ununguq scholar E. Tuck, on the topic of place, which is a very relevant topic for ecopsychology. But as Tuck argues, the desire of settlers to develop a sense of place, or to emplace themselves, as she puts it, is the desire to resolve the settlers' painful experience of dislocation from living on stolen land. So what settler emplacement actually becomes is a process of indigenous replacement, as if indigenous nations and peoples have become extinct. So I live in a community with lots of back-to-the-landers, and where there's lots of talk about placemaking and finding our home. So what Tuck says, you know, it rings very true for me, and is rightly quite unsettling. So that's a sort of first sense of what this all could mean. And then second of all, as ecopsychologists, I think we do need to lend our energies directly towards indigenous decolonization and resurgence. So I've myself started to become active in my little community in this way. And this is how we can most sincerely attempt to form relationships with indigenous communities and really start to learn about the nature of the modern world and how it actually gets made. And this actually does require that we, as settlers, make a commitment to being in a place, to being in a region, but without the illusion that we can emplace ourselves as a form of indigenous replacement. And finally, again, speaking, you know, very broadly, if the capitalist system and the colonial system are really one and the same, then all of us are harmed by the deep colonial structures that continually make our world. And so I think as settlers or non-Indigenous people, we do need to engage in our own processes of decolonization. Indeed, by my way of thinking, such processes are exactly what ecopsychology is. That's what we're doing. Recognizing, of course, that what decolonization means will differ from one person to the next, depending on our various social locations or positions, which give us different experiences and responsibilities. So one way to frame this is to say that if ecopsychology is about being fully alive in a living world, you know, that's one way we can put it, then it's also a protest against the deadliness of modernity, you know, at least implicitly. That's what we're doing as ecopsychologists. And if the source of this deadliness is the capitalist colonial system, then again, all of the enlivening work we do as ecopsychologists is best seen as taking place both sort of in and against this deadly system, the system that's brought us the Extinction Rebellion movement, for example. So another important way to see this deadliness is as what I call a death of the social. Death of the social. So, so the sociologist Orlando Patterson, he uses the term social death to describe modern racism and slavery, given that enslaved Africans were not seen as part of society. So they've died to society. And as I mentioned a moment ago, whatever is categorized in the modern world as nature rather than as society is devalued, is cheapened, and so not deemed worthy of moral consideration. Right, so this is a very deliberate strategy. And the capital era began, in fact, with what Carolyn Merchant, the ecofeminist environmental historian Carolyn Merchant, calls the death of nature, where I'll quote her here. She says, "The image of an organic cosmos with a living female earth at its center gave way to a mechanistic worldview in which nature was reconstructed as dead and passive." So in other words, the de-animating and mechanizing of the more than human world denied it any social standing. It erased the society of nature, which, as Merchant emphasizes, removes any ethical constraints against exploiting a living female earth, which then in turn sanctioned the modern scientific domination of nature under the emerging capitalist mode of production. So this is the basic move. You remove some part of reality from kind of social standing, which removes any kind of moral consideration toward that part of reality, and then you can do what you want with it. So this involves a continual shrinking of the social. So we've just kind of got, white property owning men, and then everything else is, more or less nature. So ecopsychology as decolonial practice, then, I'm saying it involves a reclaiming of the social, reversing this process. Including, first of all, a reclaiming of the natural world as a field of social relations. So reanimating the society of nature, which is a term used by some ecological anthropologists. But such praxis also involves, this very difficult work of building human social bonds that undo all the hierarchies and the binaries created by the colonial system, when it places the groups of people it values in the category of society and all the groups it devalues into the category of nature. A fellow named Boaventura de Souza Santos, he uses a line, he calls it the abyssal line. It's this line between society and nature. Whenever it's outside of society, on the other side of society and nature, that just kind of gets dropped into the abyss, he says. So we're trying to undo that line. And as an attack on the idea of society as such, furthermore, the capitalist colonial system creates a general state of what we could call psychosocial disintegration, where we're, disintegrated from society as individuals, which then gives rise to all the addiction and loneliness and alienation and anxiety and depression and demoralization and violence and so on. All these things we're all just all too familiar with. And furthermore, as a result of the commodification of culture under the capitalist colonial system, our modern world has virtually no culture in the deep sense of a beautiful symbolic life and an ethical material practices that are the stuff of enduring social connections. So that there's almost nothing giving our society any kind of coherence beyond, the money system. And if the money system collapses or fails, well then, we don't have any social basis, at all. So this is a very worrying situation. So ecopsychology as decolonial practice means, just to sum up here a little bit, it means channeling everything we do as ecopsychologists into a project, not just of rebuilding society, as if we actually had one, but to actually create or reanimate genuine social bonds as such, including with the earth, and countering the disconnection and the ugliness and the moral decay that's baked into capitalist civilization. In decolonial practice, then, this is, of course, very unsettling at times, which is, I think, why as a field we've really, skirted the topic. But if we're creating new kinds of social bonds as part of this work, then we're actually creating the emotional and the spiritual holding environments, for tolerating the process, as well as for reducing the sense of trauma, that many of us are experiencing just from being alive at this moment in history. So in a way, decolonial practice is about getting a good picture of what it means to be human. And then just doing that with some courage, no matter what the world looks like, and without, too much thought about the future, I think. And I think this is a way to give our lives, deep meaning and dignity at a time when both of these are in pretty short supply. So, I know I've been speaking in very broad terms here, and there are many points I couldn't really address in a talk like this, quite brief. And many points I could really never really address, given that a lot of this, is yet to be worked out, needs to be worked out in particular places with particular people. And as much I'm still trying to learn myself. But I hope I provided, a little food for conversation we can have now, and so I'll end it there. Thanks.